Welcome to California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance. We are joined by Adam Hill today. He is a supervisor in San Luis Obispo County. Before he joined the board, he was a professor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, which is part of the reason why I want to speak with you about the tragedy that befell UCSB. Cal Poly, UCSB, they're kind of almost like sister campuses. They're just an hour and a half apart.
Right.
I want to get a sense from you how you're feeling in the wake of this tragedy, really almost as a professor, like as someone who taught in college.
It's devastating, I think, just like it is for anybody, to know that something as horrible as this happened, and it's senseless as this could happen. And we had time when I was at Cal Poly. There was some things that happened. There was a serial killer where 2 girls were abducted and killed, and it was a really terrible time on the campus. It really was very upsetting.
I had been an adjunct professor for a time at Whittier College in Southern California, and I had a student come up to me, and she indicated to me that she felt she was a victim of a date rape, and it was very disturbing. And so I contacted the administration, and it went on from there. When you look at the perpetrator of this incident, it's hard to believe that there weren't signals beyond what the parents were hearing, feeling, or saying. Right. Again, I don't want to start pointing fingers at faculty and stuff, but what's your sense? As a professor, if you saw a kid that seemed in distress, what do you do? What can we do?
It's a hard call to make, other than referring. And I had.
Had you made references?
Oh,
ever?
sure. I mean, I had students that came that were upset, and not necessarily because I thought that they were. If they were threats to anybody, it might have been themselves.
Right, exactly.
And so there was a couple of times when I literally walked students to the counseling center just so that I knew they would go.
Right.
From what I've read, which is probably the same as everybody else, it seemed like his folks had some concern, and that's why they had
the welfare check.
Right. So there were signs, but it's hard to really know. And I think from the perspective of a professor, and I'm not exactly sure what kind of classes he took, but you have a classroom that could be anywhere from 30 to 150 people.
Right.
So it's hard for them to observe anything that might, unless a student actually comes to see you, or another student says, there's this kid that's in class with me and he's doing these things. I think it's hard for anybody to really have a sign of it, probably other than roommates or a family member. I don't know who would.
What would you recommend if we have a sense that a loved one, a friend, is descending into the depths of depression?
Right.
What would you recommend?
I think from what we know, regardless of a violent act like this, you should take everything really seriously. Right. And so regardless, you should be very insistent on not just saying you should go get help, but like in the instance where I did with a couple of students through the years, just walk them over there. Right. And say, let me help you get to a counselor so that at least you gotta try to be as active as you can.
And
when
what's
you know
so
somebody.
tricky is that mental illness often creeps upon humans really right around college age.
Yeah, especially young men.
Right, that's when it all kind of comes to the surface and percolates.
Right.
I mean, I understand that the perpetrator, this is all post-mortem, but believe he was probably on the verge of a psychosis, if not in a psychosis. Sure. Had you ever seen that where you thought this kid is breaking? I mean, before our very eyes?
I've seen kids that were certainly having difficulties. Typically it wasn't as, again, that's why it's hard in a classroom setting. It's not always as evident. If a student feels comfortable enough to come to see you, or maybe one of their friends or classmates comes to see you, that's it.
When we come back, I want to speak more about this tragedy, how it hit particularly at home in San Luis Obispo County. For our viewers on HLN, I want to thank you so much for joining us. For our other viewers, we're going to be right back with Supervisor Adam Hill of San Luis Obispo County. Supervisor, this incident was a tragedy regardless, but it really hit close to home because this county lost one of its own.
Right.
The young man who was killed at the deli lived in, I think it was Los Osos, which is an unincorporated community right outside of the city of San Luis Obispo. He went to
San Luis High.
I mean, that's kind of like the high school in this county.
Yeah, and from all accounts, a terrific kid, popular, played baseball.
I understand that you have a relative that knew him? Or?
Yeah, my stepdaughter graduated at the same time with him and knew him and said he was a sweet kid. Kind of kid that people like and remember.
His wife, his mother a deputy district attorney here in San Luis Obispo County. His father, I understand, works in Santa Barbara County as a criminal defense lawyer. I want to talk about the father. Yeah, it's undeniable that the father is experiencing tremendous grief. I mean, I can't even imagine as the father of 2 children myself.
Absolutely.
In his initial statement, he lashed out very strongly against politicians, specifically against the National Rifle Association. And it does beg the question, and I ask you specifically because you represent a county which to me is a bit schizophrenic as it relates to gun rights. You know, you have the urban centers that don't feel as if they're as protective as the Second Amendment as the rural centers.
Right.
So talk to us about the challenges elected officials like yourself have in representing counties that really, you know, aren't speaking with one voice.
Yeah, well, you know, it's true. Well, as you know, we don't have any say over gun control.
Of course.
But I think that, you know, we have these debates when these terrible things happen, but they don't seem to lead anywhere. I admire, you know, Mr. Martinez's willingness to try to be involved and to really ask people to continue to put pressure to make this into a substantive debate. And I'm not really sure what that looks like. My feeling is, yeah, there's a lot of people that have guns that shouldn't have guns. And by that I mean people who have demonstrable illnesses, mental illnesses that might make them at greater risk of hurting themselves and others.
At the same time, we are so focused on mental illness in the wake of this incident. But, you know, the statistics, you can play with statistics, but a lot of the violence is not committed by those that are mentally ill.
Right.
You know, a lot of gun violence is simply committed, you know, healthy people for a variety of reasons. And so, in your mind, is this really a red herring and it kind of deflects from the underlying issue, which is what some would argue the proliferation of guns in our society?
I think that there's a lot of issues, and certainly it's a legitimate issue. If you look at this kind of killing where innocent people are killed randomly, I think most of those people are mentally ill. I mean, where gun crimes may be committed by people who know other people, and they may not be mentally ill because it's something like a relationship or a friendship gone bad. Incidents like this is, you know, where he just went out to randomly kill people. Almost all of those incidents, those kind of shootings that we've seen in schools, have been people who are mentally ill.
So the irony of the situation is it appears that the perpetrator bought the guns and the bullets legally.
Correct.
I mean, I think that's undeniable at this point.
Yeah.
Even though he had 3 run-ins with the law at a certain level, his parents, both parents, divorced, so they're independently contacting authorities. I mean, is our mental health check, the way that we do these background checks, does this need repair?
Yeah. Yep. I mean, I think incident after incident suggests that, to me at least, that we should do, you know, I know that there's this debate about the constitutionality of it, but I think if people are going to be, it seems that people are more likely to harm themselves if they're mentally ill and they have the ability to have weapons, and they're more likely to harm others.
What's interesting, under California law, which is fairly strict as it relates to gun control, a mere diagnosis of mental illness does not preclude gun ownership. There needs to be some type of court adjudication, involuntary institutionalization. Is that something we should look at, or is, I mean, a lot of us have diagnoses of anxiety, depression. Does that mean that we should be able to own a gun?
Well, I don't think it should also be the only way we would stop somebody from purchasing a gun is that they actually have to be institutionalized, or there has to be a court order. I mean, I think that professionals can probably make some kind of diagnosis and some kind of suggestion about whether somebody is potentially a danger, or their illness is potentially one that can get bad enough if left untreated that it could be done danger.
It's a very frightening time. My niece is a student at UCSB. She was at home for Memorial Day weekend. A friend of mine's brother lives in the apartment building right next door to, I think it was the Alpha Phi house where that incident happened. So I just want to make sure that we all stay safe and out of harm's way. Adam Hill, I want to thank you so much for joining us. He is a member of the Board of Supervisors in San Luis Obispo County. My name is Brad Pomerance. We'll be right back on California Edition.
What percentage of school shooters plan their attack in advance as opposed to just snapping? 57, 71, 82, or 93%? According to the FBI, 93% of school assailants plan the attack well in advance, some for months or even years.
It's California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. Chris Ungar is joining us. He is on the school board at San Luis Coastal, but also the vice president of the California School Boards Association. And recently, I believe you were at a CSBA meeting and you heard from one of the original Little Rock Nine.
Yeah, we heard from a woman named Dr. Melba Portillo Beals, who was one of the original Little Rock Nine. And I'll remind people that that was the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Our younger viewers won't remember that, but I certainly...
They may not have been alive.
They may not have been alive,
Right.
But they've probably seen images of black children trying to get into this high school, mobs preventing them from getting in there, and then ultimately President Eisenhower ordered the 101st Airborne to protect these kids.
I went to law school with, is it Orville Faubus's?
Oh, okay.
That's the governor of Arkansas.
Yep, at the time.
His granddaughter.
Wow.
And it's quite a heritage to have. I know she had very mixed emotions about her grandfather. At the same time, one is a product of their time, a product of their era.
Exactly.
And so it's easy to cast aspersions looking backward. That being said, what's most remarkable about the Little Rock Nine is it occurred as a result of a Supreme Court decision that we know as Brown versus Board of Education. We are celebrating the 60th year of Brown versus Board. But before Brown versus Board, there was a decision that we know as Mendez versus Westminster, as in Westminster, California. I heard an NPR report about it. It was the precursor to Brown v. Board.
Absolutely the precursor to Brown versus Board of Education in California. And people don't realize this. Now, certainly Brown versus Board of Education was a milestone, a watershed in jurisprudence in the United States and constitutional law. The ending of separate but equal. But in California, 7 years before, in 1947, a Hispanic group led by Mr. Mendez sued the Board of Education in Westminster, California, down in Orange County, saying separate but equal is not separate but equal, and won in federal court. That meant California schools were desegregated beginning in 1947, but it was also the beginning of desegregation throughout California.
What's interesting about California segregation, it was not by law, it was by fact. So, it's de jure versus de facto, and so a little different situation, no less painful for those that are getting a substandard education. But it's interesting that we're talking about this right now because 60 years later,
60 years.
But I do feel as if we're still fighting the war when it relates to race relations in schools. Obviously, it's not as heated as it was, but even recently in Sacramento, there was a knockdown, drag-out fight about affirmative action.
There was.
Prop 209.
Yep.
And so it gets a little shocking to think that 60 years later, the conversation continues.
Right, and it has continued, and the question about whether affirmative action actually does what it says it's supposed to do is still out there, or whether affirmative action is fair. There was a huge firestorm over the proposal to eliminate Proposition 209, primarily from groups who felt that if there were more affirmative action, their kids would not have access to the universities of California.
And I want to dig deeper in this because it is a fascinating conversation about what groups took umbrage to the consideration of the repeal of Prop 209. For our viewers on HLN, I want to thank you so much for joining us. For our other viewers, we are speaking with Chris Ungar. He is the vice president of the California School Boards Association. I'm Brad Pomerance. We'll be right back. So let's continue the conversation about Proposition 209. As you know, it was passed in 1996, and it precluded any governmental agency from making a preference based upon race and gender, etc. So we look at admissions to the UC, for example, and what we see is since Prop 209, admissions for Latinos is actually spiking a little bit. It's going up. For whites, seems to be going down a little bit. For African Americans, flat.
Yeah.
For Asian Americans, soaring.
Right.
And where are Asian American groups on the question today?
Well, and I think that's where it really began, Brad, and that you've hit the nail on the head. The first thing we need to realize is that admission to CSUs and UCs is based essentially on scarcity. There are only so many slots available.
But here's
and
the
everybody wants their kid to go to the best university they can. Asian Americans clearly are doing the things that need to be done in order to get into the universities.
Here's the rub, though. If you look at pure demography, Asian Americans are being admitted to the UCs beyond their percentage of the California population. Whereas African Americans are being admitted to the UC at a lower rate as it relates to their population in the state. And so that's where the question gets conflated. Are Asian Americans being admitted because they have more privilege, because they go to better schools? Are African Americans not being admitted because they have less privilege, they go to worse schools? Do we need to somehow change the calculation because the tests aren't fair, because the test, we can go on and on.
The tests aren't fair. Grade point average, in some ways, grade point average is a great predictor of success in schools. But if we also dig a little bit deeper and look at what UCLA calls the resegregation of California, where African American children, Latino children, are being really segregated based on poverty and housing patterns in schools that are that have higher levels of second language learners, higher levels of poverty.
But we have changed our education funding formula.
And we've changed our education funding formula, and
to the benefit of those groups.
And the thing we talked about last time was the Vergara discussion, which is, do kids in schools that are in pockets of poverty have access to better teachers or not?
Well,
so there are all these things that I think play into all this.
And the
Brad.
Vergara decision, which we are awaiting as we speak, is fascinating in that what the Vergara plaintiffs are saying is that the concept of last in, first out is by definition unconstitutional, because the last in tend to be newer teachers going to inner city schools that try to get out as soon as they can. And so as a result, they're saying a churn of teachers constantly without any experienced teachers surviving.
Right, and that's exactly what they're talking about, is this churn of teachers. And I think what we want to see is and what's important for kids is to have a solid teacher who's there for the kids, who can be dependent upon. Now, when there are layoff after layoff after layoff, you do get less experienced teachers. Now, interestingly enough, in Sacramento, some of the schools in poverty actually spent more money with staff development for their teachers, for their younger teachers, who would have been first in, last in, first out, right? And the claim was made that special staff development, those special trainings that they had, made them immune from the automatic layoffs.
Let me ask you in our final moments, what did you take away from Dr. Melba Portillo Beal's speech, one of the Little Rock Nine?
That there is a lot more to be done, that we have come a long way since 1957, when she was shot at in her home, when she was forced out of Little Rock, Arkansas. And the reason we even became aware of her, she was moved to Santa Rosa because it was felt to be a safe place. And even in Santa Rosa in 1957, she faced racial discrimination. We've come a long way. I think we've got a lot more to go. And I'm hopeful that with the new LCFF, with this awareness, we can do something about it.
His name is Chris Ungar. He is the Vice President of the California School Boards Association. I'm Brad Pomerance, and this is California Edition.
In what year did Latinos bypass Anglos in the number of in-state students offered admission to a University of California campus? It has not happened. 2010, 2012, or 2014? In 2014, 29% of all in-state applicants accepted as freshmen at one of the University of California's 9 undergraduate campuses are Latino, compared to 27% of the admitted applicants who are Anglo.
This is California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance, and we are joined by Mark Buchman. He is a trustee at San Luis Coastal Unified School District in San Luis Obispo County. Sir, these indeed arguably are scary times when you look at violence on school campuses and around school campuses. 2012, Newton, Connecticut, 20 killed. We know at Virginia Tech in 2007, 56 were killed or injured. Columbine in 1999, 39 killed or injured. Jonesboro, Arkansas, 15 killed and injured. Of course, recently, right down south at Isla Vista, UCSB, 12 killed or injured. Talk to me about how you're feeling today.
Well, I might cry. It's a horrible experience. I have 2 children, one in college, and it's just a horrible tragedy. And I just don't know how, as a parent, I could take that. I don't know how, as a person that's responsible for 7,500 kids in San Luis Obispo, can take it. But I know that we have to do it. We have to work to change it, and we need, as a community, to come together and solve it, because schools can't do that.
What's interesting about these horrors is that when you think about Newtown, Connecticut, when you think about Virginia Tech, when you think about UCSB, these were acts committed by adults. When you look at Jonesboro, Columbine, acts committed by children, different challenges when you look at those 2 populations.
Right.
How do you address that as a school board member, those separate and distinct challenges?
So I think one of the first things we need to look at is, though we have these very scary events that are happening, when we track violent acts on campus, they're actually down for the last 20 years. So media, instant replay, all of that stuff contributes to our sense that it's just horrible. When in fact, people will tell you, the FBI, the Secret Service have reports on this, that schools are still the safest place to be. That said,
what we do know is that a lot of the perpetrators of these acts, almost to the last one, expressed a sense of victimization. Felt as if they were on the receiving end of and mistreatment, that they were bullied. Bullying is such a dicey conversation. I mean, I feel as if today there is a no tolerance policy for bullying. When I was in school, it happened all the time. So there's almost a schizophrenia where I feel like bullying is not permitted, but yet people are feeling more victimized and lashing out more frequently.
Yes. And what you have is, you have the California Healthy Kids Survey. You have kids reporting to the Secret Service in their report that I think it's like 42% of kids feel that they have been bullied, had names called, and it's happening on not just face-to-face or in the locker room. It's happening when they pick up their phone.
Cyber, yeah.
And it's turned into cyberbullying. The state of California has done a wonderful job, and every year for the past, number of years, there's been new legislation. So we had a safe place to learn.
Oh, it's interesting. I know recently California passed a law which allowed schools to assume jurisdiction for cyberbullying, even if that cyberbullying did not occur on campus.
Yes.
Which is, a bold step. Is bullying on the rise anecdotally? I mean, what are you seeing?
I don't know whether bullying is on the rise. You talk about when you were in school. I can tell you about when I was in school. I'm not sure it's on the rise. I think people are understanding that it's a precursor to possibly much worse acts.
What I want to do when we come back is talk about mental illness, because oftentimes there is a focus on mental illness when we see these tragedies take place. For our viewers on HLN, I want to thank you so much for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back with Mark Buchman of San Luis Coastal. So, sir, I want to speak with you about mental illness. We know that if someone is going to have what's known as a break, a psychotic break, usually that will happen somewhere 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, maybe a little older. That's right around the end of high school, beginning of college. And so where are schools today in trying to assist those that are on the verge of a break, maybe breaking, have broken?
I think several things have happened across the state. One of them, many school districts have adopted what's called asset development. Asset development has a lot of pieces to it, but one of the pieces that I feel is most important is, and districts and schools are doing this as well, trying to make sure that each student has an adult that pays attention to them and is available for each individual student. And I think that's critical. I think it's critical for the student, and I think it's critical for identification.
What's interesting is I was recently speaking with a law enforcement official, and he had been requested to go on a welfare check, and this was in a college community. And this is a large college community in California, and that college student felt as if he had no one to turn to. So when in reality that college did have mental health services. And so even if they're there, there's a sense of hopelessness, helplessness. Where do we go from here?
I think part of what we need to do is we need to start working with the community, the families, and the kids at a much younger age. And we need to destigmatize mental health. It should be okay to say, I'm lonely. I'm feeling that people are picking on me. It really needs to be able to be okay. But we still have people in this community and across the state and the nation that say, oh, come on, buck up.
Right.
You can handle it. Be a man.
And it's interesting you say that, because that's absolutely accurate. And when you look at the perpetrators of these grand, violent, guns a-blazing schemes, they are young men, often of Anglo descent. I mean, it is, it's that stereotype they don't feel as if they can meet, and they feel more victimized, they feel more incompetent, more of that sense of being less than. What are your parents saying about the Isla Vista incident? I mean, Isla Vista is a mere hour and a half from where we are today in San Luis Obispo. I am sure that plenty of kids from San Luis Coastal go to UCSB. We happen to know that Christopher Martinez, one of those that were killed, grew up in Los Osos. Is that a San Luis Coastal community?
Yes, it is. It is.
So did he go to a San Luis Coastal school, do you know?
As far as I know, yes, he did. He graduated.
Good grief.
Yeah, he's a recent graduate.
So
What we've heard and what we continue to hear is, are my kids safe? How come your schools don't have fences? How come your schools don't have metal detectors? And my response to that is pretty simple. One, we have very small school, tight communities.
Right.
So one principle across the United States, we're a nation that has the worst ratio of kids to counselors, worst ratio of kids to administrators, worst ratio of kids, period, in everything. So that one-to-one connection. We're lucky in San Luis Obispo because we have that small sense of community. The other point I'd like to make is, when we hear about those things, well, we've also had some interesting situations at military bases recently.
Fort Hood,
Fort
twice in the
Hood,
last 5-10 years.
Brooklyn Navy Shipyard, and so when I think about those, okay, they're entirely enclosed by fences. They have metal detectors, and they have a lot of people, a lot of people with guns walking around. And so I look at that and I go, are any of those solutions the answer? Fences, metal detectors, guns on base, guns on schools? And I have to say to myself, that's not the answer.
So is the answer mental health?
I think mental health, I think it's identifying children with other issues as they're growing up. So poverty is one of them, cognitive development.
Yeah, I mean, this boy in Isla Vista who was driving a BMW.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a wealthy,
We have to
appears
assume.
he came from a wealthy family.
Yeah. But the wonderful thing is that his parents
They
were
tried.
tied in and knew. They asked for that, and so they tied in.
It's a devastating scenario, but I want to thank you so much for what you're doing to keep the children of San Luis Coastal and this county safe. His name is Mark Buchman. He is a trustee at San Luis Coastal Unified School District. I'm Pomerance, and this is California Edition.